Right now, recommendations on classification are under definitions contained in law, and those recommendations are made by firearms experts in the RCMP, who both the gun lobby and the government members have referred to as bureaucrats. These are, in fact, the RCMP firearms experts. The minister's signature is required on any reclassification, but there is no discretion for the minister, providing the recommendations fall within the scope of the existing legislative definitions. What Bill C-42 suggests is that Cabinet should be able to ignore the classification recommendations from the public experts and substitute its own wisdom about how weapons should be classified. And the minister's already told us today that when this bill passes, he tends to use this political process to reclassify two individual types of guns. So C-42 goes even further in allowing Cabinet to grant exemptions for guns and ammunition which would otherwise have been prohibited by varying the definitions in the legislation. So where did this perceived need for a change come from? It came from the single case of the reclassification of a single weapon, the Swiss Arms PE-90, or classic greens as they are sometimes called. These are military-style weapons which have been sold for nearly 20 years in Canada as a semi-automatic weapon limited to firing 5 rounds. Before 2013, there were approximately 2,000 of these weapons in Canada, worth about $4,000 each. So why the reclassification? What we had in Calgary in 2013 was the sudden appearance of so-called refurbished models of this gun, which were now operating as automatic weapons. These meant that these weapons were now easily converted to automatic weapons capable of firing a long series of shots from a single trigger pull. Exactly what the designation prohibited was designed to keep off the streets in Canada. When there was an immediate outcry from the gun lobby, the Conservatives were quick to grant a 2-year amnesty in March of 2014. An amnesty for which I believe legal authority is doubtful at best. How can the government grant an amnesty on possessing a weapon which is prohibited by law in Canada? But now this government has presented C-42 as the solution, giving the Conservative Cabinet the power to decide if these dangerous weapons should be allowed in Canada. And quite apart from the danger of ending up with automatic weapons on the street, there's another principle at stake here. When we make laws, we make them in public, after public debate, and they stay in force until there's another public debate about changing them. Public debate before changing law is essential to democracy and accountability. In fact, what we have in Bill C-42 is the creation of a process whereby Canada can, in effect, change our gun classification system and the classification of individual weapons by making decisions behind closed doors and without any public debate. The other major change in Bill C-42 is removing the requirement which exists in most provinces to have a permit in any vehicle transporting restricted firearms, and the bill goes further, it prohibits any province from reintroducing such a requirement. Currently, permits must specify a reason for transporting the firearm and specify that the travel must be from a specific point A to a specific point B. This makes it easy for the police to enforce the prohibition on the illegal transportation of firearms by providing a specific permit and a specific route. C-42 rolls transportation permits into the license to own firearms. This will automatically allow the transportation of firearms between the owner's home and a list of 5 kinds of places: to any gun range, to any gun shop, to any gun show, to any police station, and to any border post for exiting from Canada. This provides a vast array of excuses for having weapons in a vehicle along a myriad set of plausible routes. And this change will make the prohibition on illegal transportations of weapons virtually impossible for police to enforce. And again, I want to say that's why I'm concerned about the notice the member for Dauphin Swan River Marquette has given about a bill to amend the criminal code on firearms storage and transportation. I'm looking forward to having the opportunity in committee of having law enforcement representatives present so that we can talk to them about the impact of this change of no longer requiring specific permits from a specific place to a specific place for restricted firearms. I think there's a great deal of danger here for Canadians. There are, of course, some other provisions of this bill about which we have some questions. And most of those questions will be about whether those changes, like combining the two kinds of licenses and creating a grace period after the expiry of a license, whether these changes will have negative consequences on completing timely checks as to whether owners remain authorized to own firearms after criminal or mental health incidents. We will be asking for assurances from the Minister on these questions in committee. There's nothing more important to public safety than we make sure that the system works so that those who are convicted of criminal activity or those who have experienced mental health difficulties are no longer in possession of firearms. And you have to look no further than this Parliament Hill to understand the importance of those kinds of checks. Now, does anything in this bill look good to New Democrats? The Minister was asking me that earlier as a kind of heckle. Certainly, measures which make prohibitions on gun ownership easier in cases of domestic violence are very welcome, as are expanded requirements for gun safety courses. And since there are a couple of positives in this bill, the Minister might ask, well, why aren't we trying to improve this bill in committee? Why haven't we said we'll support it at second reading? Now, I have to say, I've become more than a bit cynical about this. On Bill C-44, just last week, the Minister assured me we could have full debate in committee on the bill expanding the powers of CSIS. He said it was up to the committee to make its own decision, as if the government doesn't have a majority on every committee, and as if his parliamentary secretary didn't move motions which restrict debate in committee. I mean, it beggars belief that you would make this argument in the House of Commons. But on Bill C-44, where the government said it would like all-party support, and where we clearly were told by the Minister that the Public Safety Committee was the place for detailed debate, this afternoon, while we're in the House here, the committee is getting its only afternoon with opposition witnesses. It's only 2 hours to discuss the bill that's expanding the powers of CSIS. So that's why, Mr. Minister, even though there are a couple of good things in this bill, I can't argue that we should support the bill to go to committee and try and fix the rest, because the experience again and again we have in committee is limited time, limited witnesses, and the absolute refusal of the government to accept even the best intentioned, even the most non-political amendments from the opposition. So clearly, Mr. Speaker, public safety is not the priority for Conservatives in C-42. In fact, its two main provisions seem to present clear threats to public safety to me. If we have political decisions being made about whether a gun is or is not a prohibited weapon, I don't think that bodes well for future public safety. And if we have this gray area that we've now introduced in terms of transportation of weapons, I don't think that bodes well for public safety. So, Mr. Speaker, let me conclude by saying that I find it both sad and insensitive on the part of the government to be discussing this bill in the lead-up to December 6th. This is a national day dedicated to remembering the victims of the Ecole Polytechnique massacre 25 years ago, and a day set aside for recommitting to the fight against violence against women. And I do not understand why the Conservatives want to proceed so abruptly with this bill to loosen gun regulations in the aftermath of the murder of Corporal Nathan Cirillo at the War Memorial and the attack here in Parliament. I would ask the government to put off further consideration of this bill until well into the new year, a less emotional time for victims, and to give time for the air to clear after the October 22nd incident here on the Hill. Will the government show more respect for Canadians and our democratic process by delaying this bill? I doubt it. Instead, I expect them to press on to the tune of the dog whistle played by the gun lobby friends of theirs. Unfortunately, I think Canadians already know the answer to this question, Mr. Speaker, that the gun lobby rules and that this bill will press ahead, and that's why, as a New Democrat, I will be proud to vote against Bill C-42.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to, make an observation. The observation is that criminals who commit gun-related crimes don't follow the law. And what the Liberals did in their era, Mr. Speaker, is they tried to curtail crime by shackling and burdening law-abiding gun owners. Those would be gun owners who follow the law, like myself, because I'm a gun owner myself, Mr. Speaker, burdening them and shackling them with unnecessary and complicated laws and restrictive laws. Now, the minister has brought about a bill to ease that because they are law-abiding gun owners, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, the NDP have bought into the misguided Liberal logic that somehow criminals follow the law when they don't. So I'm wondering if this member could in fact just agree that criminals don't follow the law and that the intent of this bill is actually to respect law-abiding Canadians and the fact that they are allowed to own guns and they should not be shackled and overburdened, Mr. Speaker, with unnecessary rules, regulations and laws. There have to be a minimum amount in place, but not unduly so, as was presented by the Liberal Party in their day, Mr. Speaker.
For a Esquimalt, one to Fuca.
Well, I thank the Parliamentary Secretary for his question. I guess I would have to start by saying that everybody's law-abiding until they're not. And so the question doesn't make much sense to me. It's more of the rhetoric from the gun lobby. Obviously, there are legitimate uses for guns. There are legitimate demands for having guns. If you're a hunter, if you're a sport shooter, we totally accept that on this side of the House. What we're saying is that we have to have reasonable regulations in place to protect public safety. And the first way you have to judge these laws is, do they protect public safety? Not, do you have to fill out forms, right?
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have a question for my honourable friend, who we sit in the committee together. And I guess one of the most he raised a number of points in terms of some of the witnesses that we would need to hear from at committee. Canadian firearms officers, police, people who have been involved with transport of guns, etc. One of the difficulties, as we know, and both he and I are missing the debate on C-44 because the government called this bill at the same time. And the problem is, I would wonder what the member's thoughts are, and could he tell Canadians the problems with committees in terms of, yes, we may have this debate in here, it'll likely be closure put on it at some point in time. How is our ability curtailed at committee to hear the proper people we should hear from to deal with this issue? And one of the most important to deal with this issue, Mr. Speaker, is the issue my leader raised in question period, and that is the open-ended transportation of guns. Yes, they had to be in a trunk locked, but as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture said, criminals don't follow the rules. Of course they don't. But if there's guns in trunks of cars, most of the guns criminals use are stolen from legitimate gun owners. And isn't that a problem with the new transport rules?
Member for Esquimalt, one to Fuca.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question, and I guess there's two things there. One I would say is I'm a former municipal police board member, and I've done a lot of international policing work. And it's very rare that you come across police who believe that gun regulations are red tape. Yeah. Police are very supportive of reasonable regulations. They don't want extra forms. They don't want extra time wasted. But reasonable regulations are something that police are quite often in favor of. So I look very much forward to having the time in committee to hear from law enforcement officials on the question of transportation of weapons. However, I have to say, as I did earlier, I've kind of lost my faith that we're going to have adequate time in committees after my experience with C-44. I would ask the minister again, but I know his answer that it has nothing to do with him and his parliamentary secretary and the majority on the committee. It's just out of the air that we get these restrictions on time and the number of witnesses.
Question commentaire, la députée de Saint-Bruno, Saint-Aubert.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Depuis que je suis élue, et tous les Canadiens l'ont remarqué, que ce gouvernement conservateur en remarque de plus en plus, il ne gouverne pas pour les Canadiens et Canadiennes, mais plutôt pour sa base électorale. Et aujourd'hui, avec ce projet de loi C-42, on se rend compte aussi qu'il y a le lobby des armes à feu. Il travaille pour ce lobby-là. Donc, nous savons que ce gouvernement n'a pas consulté au préalable les organismes chargés de l'application de la loi sur les répercussions que les changements proposés auront sur la sécurité publique, comme la CAF au Québec. Ma question pour mon collègue, ne pense-t-il pas que ce projet de loi C-42, ça va à l'inverse du concept de la sécurité publique et la sécurité des citoyens?
Member for Esquimalt, one to Fuca.
Well, I thank the honourable member for questions, and that's exactly my point, that public safety has to be our first concern in any of the changes that we're making to gun licensing and gun regulation. But I would also like to remind the House that when the gun registry was being eliminated, the Conservatives were saying that's all we need to do.